Wow. All right, finally. Okay, so we are going to talk about chapter 22. Okay, we're going to go over chapter 22 first, and then we're going to play the endocrine game at the end. Hopefully we have time. I know I waste a lot of time here. So, chapter 22 is talking about the lymphatic system. Okay, the lymphatic system. So the lymphatic system basically has two functions. First of all, it is going to return any extra fluid in your interstitial spaces, and it's going to return it back to your veins. Right? So, you have fluid. You have to understand fluid movement. Fluid, you have plasma in your arteries and veins, right? And from the capillaries, that fluid moves into the interstitial space. And then from the interstitial space, the fluid moves into these lymphatic vessels. And the lymphatic vessels carry that fluid back to your heart and dump it into the veins near your heart. So you have to understand fluid movement. So fluid movement, again, it goes from the capillaries. So we have capillaries. Those are, the only vessels where things can be exchanged with the environment. And that fluid would be called plasma. That's the fluid in the capillaries. That fluid leaks out into the interstitial space. Okay, and the fluid in the interstitial space is called interstitial fluid. All right, and then that interstitial fluid is going to leak into the lymphatic vessels. And the lymphatic vessels, the fluid inside those is called lymph. Lymph. Okay? So then that lymph gets carried through the lymphatic vessels, and it's going to be delivered up near the heart into the right and left subclavian veins. And then from there, it's going to be delivered to the capillaries again. Right? So the lymphatic vessels are helping to make sure that your interstitial tissues aren't swollen, that you don't have swelling everywhere. We're taking that fluid and putting it back in the vessels, and then that's dumping back into your blood. And so why do we need to do that? Well, along the route, if you look at this picture, you see all these green lines in there. All those green lines are the lymphatic vessels, right? They're lymphatic vessels. So as the fluid leaks out into the interstitial fluid and then into these vessels are going to carry it back up towards the heart and dump it into the subclavian veins. Bless you. And as it's going up along that way, there's some cells in there that are called lymphocytes. And then when the vessels have to go through these little tiny tissues here, these organs, those are called lymph nodes. There's even a whole bunch more lymphocytes. And the lymphocytes are going to clear that fluid from any pathogens, any bacteria or viruses that it finds, any infected cells that it finds. It's going to clear it of that stuff. So by the time it comes back up and gets dumped back into the systemic circuit, into the systemic veins, then it's been cleared of these pathogens, right? So two things. Number one, the lymphatic system helps us to circulate that fluid, all right, so that we are able to dump it back into the circulatory system. Number two, it helps to fight against infections, right? So it's part of your immune system. So we have to talk about both of those functions. So the main cell in the lymphatic system is called the lymphocytes. Okay, and the lymphocytes are floating around in the fluid that's called lymph. And there are different types of lymphocytes. There's 3 different types of lymphocytes, and we're going to talk about those 3 different types. We're also going to look at some other tissues in the body, just briefly, that are part of the lymphatic system, like the tonsils. Those are part of the lymphatic system. They also have a lot of lymphocytes in them. The thymus, okay, not to be confused with the thyroid. The thymus is right above the heart. The thyroid is in the neck. Okay. The thymus gland has something to do with these lymphocytes as well. We have the spleen, which is an organ behind your stomach, and then there's some other tissues in the intestinal area as well. So we're going to talk about each one of those things. Let's take a look at the lymphatic vessels. Now we know with the blood vessels, it's a closed circuit, right? So we know that arteries always carry blood away from the heart. So we have arteries carrying blood away from the heart. They become capillaries. The capillaries merge together to become veins, and the veins come back to the heart. So we've got this closed circuit. They never just come to an end, right? Well, with the lymphatic vessels, it's not a closed circuit. It's just this one-way highway from the periphery, from farther away, straight into those veins. So here you can see the capillary or the systemic circuit. We have here's the arterioles. Those are the smallest of the arteries. They divide, they branch off into these capillary beds. The capillaries then become the venules, which are the smallest of the veins, and that leads back to the heart. So it's a closed circuit, right? And then here we see the lymphatic capillaries. Lymphatic capillaries start at an end point, okay? So they start at a closed end point, and then they just lead back towards the heart, right? So what's happening is capillaries are the only place where we have exchange with the environment. So the plasma leaks into the interstitial space. Now it's called interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid leaks into the lymphatic vessel. Now it's called lymph. And then the lymph is carried back to the heart, right? So that's the movement of fluid. Right, so this is a bigger picture of the lymphatic capillaries. So if we look inside the lymphatic capillaries, we see these cells here. These are the lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are part of your immune system. Here's the capillary again. So the movement is plasma, interstitial fluid to lymph. And it will get dumped back into the plasma again. Here is showing a picture of the lymphatic vessel. Now the lymphatic vessels, we don't name many of the lymphatic vessels, not like we're naming arteries and veins, but they all tend to run alongside the arteries and veins. Okay, they run alongside them. So they're all kind of, and nerves a lot of times run right along that too. So we have this like neurovascular bundle and they all run together. When we look at the structure of it, you know, the arteries, we said they had thicker walls. So if you cut those, they're going to maintain their round shape. The veins have a little bit thinner walls, so they tend to collapse when they're cut. Well, the lymphatic vessels are even more fragile. They are not even as thick as veins are. They're more similar to veins than arteries, but they are actually very thin. One of the unique things that lymphatic vessels have are just like the medium-sized veins, they have a valve, all right? Because they're bringing that fluid towards the heart, and every time the heart relaxes, that fluid wants to go down towards gravity. So those valves close and they don't allow that fluid to go back down. Right? We're trying to drain the fluid from the tissues. We don't want it to leak back into the tissues. So here are the main lymphatic vessels, the ones that you have to know the names for. Right? First, I want to show you this picture right here. If we look at the green-colored man here, we can see that there's two main vessels, lymphatic vessels. One's called the right lymphatic duct. The other one is called the thoracic duct. Okay? The right lymphatic duct is only draining fluid from this light green area. So from the right arm, the right chest, the right side of the head. And the right lymphatic duct will drain all the fluid from that area that's in the interstitial area going into the lymph and drain it into the right subclavian vein. Okay? Then we have the thoracic duct. The thoracic duct is going to drain the fluid from both legs, the abdominal cavity, the left chest, the left arm, and the left side of the head. Right? So the thoracic duct has a lot more body where it's going to drain fluid from. So let's take a look at this picture and see where those vessels are. So this vessel right up here, this is on the right side of the body. This is the right lymphatic duct, and it's draining into that right subclavian vein. Okay? This here, this green area, this long green tube here, coming up and draining into the left subclavian vein, that is the thoracic duct. The thoracic duct. Now all the fluid is coming up from the legs through these lymphatic vessels. All those vessels are going to first merge together in this cistern area. Cistern is an area that holds water, right? Cistern, this expanded area down there is called the cisterna chyli. So all the fluid comes up through the lymphatic vessels from the legs, drains into the cisterna chyli and from the abdominal area, and then from the cisterna chyli, it's going to go into the thoracic duct, right? So those are structures that are going to be on your lab exam too, and those are on our lab model that we have in class. Okay, some other structures that we have in the lymphatic system then, the tonsils. There are tonsils. These tonsils have a lot of lymphocytes in them. And so, and they're found in the oral and nasal area. So when you're eating things and you're breathing things in, if there's a lot of bacteria, then those those lymphocytes in those areas are going to start to go through mitosis, and they're going to proliferate, and they're going to multiply, and they're going to produce very specialized daughter cells. So when they're multiplying, those areas get really big, right? So when you have an infection, you might have enlarged tonsils, okay? And then that's why they're enlarging, because those lymphocytes just keep multiplying and getting bigger. So the tonsils that we have, these here are called the pharyngeal tonsils. They're in the nasal pharynx. So this whole area, throat area, is called your pharynx. Because this is close to the nose or the nasal cavity, this would be the nasal or nasopharynx. And the pharyngeal tonsils are there. Pharyngeal tonsil. Now another name for the pharyngeal tonsil is the adenoid, right? That's the adenoid. Then we have the palatine tonsils. Those are the ones that are at the straight back. So when you're looking at the back of your throat and you see that little uvula, on either side of the uvula, normally you don't see the tonsils unless they're swollen, right? You can't really see them very clearly. But as they get swollen, they start to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they start to touch, which we call kissing tonsils, and then it's very hard for a person to swallow. Yes?
So when you get your tonsils removed, do you get all three removed?
Most of the time, they're removing the palatine tonsils, and there's 2 of those, but when they do that, they'll say, we should just probably go up and get rid of those adenoid too.
But like nowadays, they don't want to remove the tonsils?
No, they don't. It's not standard practice. So when I was a kid, as soon as you got strep throat the first time, out the tonsils went.
Why don't they want to do it anymore?
Because they believe that there's a definite benefit, of course, to having those. They're that's like one of the first lines of defenses. You're able to, it's able to, it comes in contact with anything you're eating or drinking or breathing in first. So they really don't want to remove those.
Don't they consider that kind of like the filter of the throat?
It is kind of like a filter. Yep. Yeah, because it is. But so I have my daughter. She had mono one time, and so her tonsils really swelled. And then after that, every time she had any type of infection, her tonsils would just swell. And so then, as an adult, she had them removed. But most of the time, unless it's a severe infection, the tonsils won't react like that. They're just going to swell when you have the infection. They'll go away, and if it's not a serious infection, they're not going to swell. Yep.
And then after you get your tonsils removed, why does your breath stay so bad? I haven't had mine removed.
Right afterwards?
Yeah.
Because of the necrosis. Because when they cauterize, they remove them, and then they cauterize the area, and then it's necrotic, and it's white. It's just white. I wonder if I have a picture of my daughter. It is, yeah. Pockets in the tonsils? Oh, yep, you can definitely, after you cut them out, there can be little holes in there that can get caught, but not in whole ones. But let me see. I don't know. Tonsil stones. Yeah, I don't think I have it. I'll have to find it for you guys. I'll have to find it for you guys later. But I did, you know, I tend to take pictures of everything, you know, with my let's see, use slideshow. I take pictures of everything with my kids. So I got some great pictures inside her mouth with after she had the tonsils out, before she had the tonsils out, so you can see all that stuff. I'll try to get that for. I'll bring that on let's see, what is today, on Thursday. I'll bring it on Thursday, or Friday. Today's Wednesday. Okay, so you have to know those tonsils, and then there's also the lingual tonsils at the bottom there. The lingual tonsils, you know, there's two of those, one of those. Okay, so on the lab exam, tonsils, tonsil. Okay, all right. Okay, then let's look at this organ. This is called a lymph node. And these are little, they look like little nodules. And I'm sure many of you have had swollen lymph nodes before, like in your neck area. The lymph nodes are found throughout the body, and they connect, they're like right in between the lymphatic vessels. So here's like an afferent, this is a lymphatic vessel, it comes into the lymph node, and then it leaves the lymph node. All right, so they're found all over, but they aggregate or they cluster in certain areas. So the areas that you have to know for the lab exam, you need to know the cervical lymph nodes. Those aggregate in the cervical area. You have to know the axillary lymph nodes. They aggregate in the axillary area. You have to know the inguinal lymph nodes. Those are in the groin. All right, so those are the places that they aggregate. Now, the lymph nodes are packed full of lymphocytes. And so they're receiving the fluid, and then the fluid leaves, and so it just has to keep going through these lymph nodes as it heads back towards those subclavian veins. What's interesting is that you know, those lymph nodes, or those lymphocytes in there, they need time. They need this fluid to slow down. So when we look at the lymph nodes, we see that there's 4 different afferent vessels, meaning these are vessels that are bringing fluid to the lymph node, and then there's only one efferent lymphatic vessel. So we've got 4 afferent lymphatic vessels coming in and 1 going out. 4 highways coming in, 1 highway going out. All that traffic, all that fluid is going to get caught up inside the lymph node, right? So that those lymphocytes that are in there, they have time to react and clean up that fluid. There's a swollen lymph node in the neck. You can see the edges of it, right? So we see these a lot in children as they're just starting to become exposed to all these different pathogens. Okay, another organ that we have is called the thymus. So the thymus sits right above the heart. Now there are 4 different, there's 3 different types of lymphocytes. There's the B cell, the T cell, and the NK cell, which we'll talk about in a minute. The T cell, all of those cells are made in the same place your red blood cells are made, which is where? Your red bone marrow. Okay, so all those cells, the B cells, the T cells, the NK cells, which stands for natural killer cells, they are all produced in the red bone marrow. But the T cells, before they are mature, they're going to migrate to the thymus, and that's where they're going to mature, right? And then they get released out into the blood, into the circulation. Okay, so, and we will talk about the cells, different cells in just a little bit. Another organ that we have is called the spleen. The spleen sits behind the stomach. On the left side is your stomach, and right behind that is the spleen. The spleen's an important area. First of all, it stores a lot of iron that's necessary for your blood formation, right? But it also has a lot of lymphocytes in there too. And so when the blood coming into the spleen has any pathogens in it, it's going to immediately activate those lymphocytes and get them fighting against the pathogens. And they will initiate a whole immune response in your body. Okay? So the spleen is really an important organ to help initiate your defense against pathogens.
What happens, like, if that's damaged or damaged?
Then they have a weakened immune system. Yep, I know people that have no spleen because they were in an accident or whatever, and they wear gloves a lot, and you know they try to stay away from very weakened immune system. Yep. Okay, so this is the red bone marrow. This is just showing the process here. So up at the top here, it's just showing the red bone marrow. And in the red bone marrow, we have those big omnipotent stem cells called the hemocytoblast. Remember, hemocytoblast can either become a myeloid stem cell or it can become a lymphoid stem cell. Remember that? The lymphoid stem cell is going to become the lymphocytes. The myeloid stem cell becomes the red blood cells, the platelets, and the other 4 white blood cells. So the lymphoid stem cell is what's going to give us our lymphocytes. And there's 2 different types of lymphoid stem cells. One type is going to give us the natural killer cells and the B cells. So the natural killer, or the NK cells and the B cells, they will stay in the bone marrow, and that's where they'll mature. Right? The other lymphoid stem cell, that's going to give us our T cells, okay? But the lymphoid stem cells, the T cells are going to mature in the thymus. So to remember this, you can see T for T cell, T for thymus, right? Think of it that way. And B for B cell, B for bone marrow. Even that's not the reason how they came up with B cell, but you can think of it that way, right? So B for bone marrow. So it's produced in the bone marrow, it matures in the bone marrow. T cell is produced in the bone marrow, but matures in the thymus, okay? Okay, so what do these different cells do? We've got the natural killer cell, we have the B cell, and we have the T cell. So let's talk briefly about those. The natural killer cell, or the NK cell, this is part of an immune response that we call immune surveillance. Immune surveillance. I think in your old notes it's called immunological surveillance, or what is it called? Immunological surveillance? Okay, so immune surveillance. So anyway, these natural killer cells, they survey all your tissues. Actually, lymphocytes go everywhere in your body, right? So these natural killer cells are everywhere in your body.
They're in the blood, then they go through the interstitial fluid.
Yes, they do. They circulate. Yep, they do. They do. They're going to circulate through the blood, going everywhere, and then sneak out of the blood vessels. All right. Now, the natural killer cells, they are non-specific. They really don't care what pathogen it is. They don't care if it's one of your cells that's infected, or whether it's a bacteria, or whether, no matter what it is, if it has antigens that it does not recognize as your antigens, it's going to shoot out chemicals at that cell called perforin. It's going to secrete these chemicals like little bullets and poke holes in that cell that it sees as abnormal, and that's going to make that cell burst. Okay? So and they don't care. They don't care if it's strep pneumonia. They don't care if it's Staph aureus. They don't care if it's MRSA. They don't care if it's C. diff. They don't care. They're just, if it looks abnormal, doesn't care if it's your cancer cell, one of your cells that's infected, it's going to just try to kill anything it can in its path, right? So that's the natural killer cells. Then we have the B cells. The B cells are part of the antibody-mediated immunity. And the reason why we call it that is the B cells are very specific. They're very specific. When they become activated, the reason they are activated is because some other cell, you know, whether it's the actual pathogen, so the strep pneumoniae bacteria, has activated the B cell, or another cell in the immune system has activated the B cell and told it that its job is to protect the body against that strep pneumoniae bacteria. And then that's the only thing that one B cell will protect you against. Okay? So it's very specific. Then there will be another B cell, and that one might become activated to the chickenpox virus. And then there's another one that might become activated towards MRSA. So they're all, you know, becoming activated to some specific pathogen. So what the B cell does then is it's going to divide, you know, it's going to go through division, and its daughter cells are going to become either plasma cells or memory B cells. Okay? So the memory B cells do nothing this infection, but they're going to hang out for the next time that infection comes around. And some of those can live up to 20 years, right? So some of them live a long time, so they'll just wait until you get infected another time with that same pathogen. The plasma cells, what they do is they secrete antibodies. So we heard about antibodies when we were talking about the blood. They're the same Y-shaped proteins, but now these antibodies are specifically going to target that either cells infected with that strep pneumoniae or with the actual strep pneumoniae bacteria. And they're going to bind to them. They're going to bind to the antigens on those cells, and they act as flags. So they'll flag down a macrophage that can come along and engulf the whole thing. Or, like they did in the red blood cell, they'll cause those cells to burst, right? Okay? So that's what antibodies do. They're going to actually destroy, they're going to help to destroy those cells, okay? Either the infected cells or the actual pathogen. Then we have the T cells. And the T cells are part of what we call the cell-mediated immunity. And the reason why we call that cell-mediated immunity is because the T cell will only become activated once your cell is infected. So that pathogen has to get into your cell. And once it's into the cell, then the T cell can attach to it and become activated, right? So once the T cell, and let me show you, let me just kind of show you what I mean by that. There's two different ways, well, there's a couple of different ways that your cells can become infected. So let me just kind of show you, I'll just draw a little bit here. Right? Okay. All right, so here's one of your cells. Okay, there's one of your cells. Let's iris go down. Right, so there's a cell. A bacteria looks kind of like that, right? That's one shape of a bacteria. So a bacteria can just kind of bind to one of your cells, and it can change the function of that cell. Changes the function so it doesn't function properly. All right, so that's kind of what a bacteria does. A virus, one of the shapes of a virus is kind of like this. Looks like a little spaceship. And inside that virus is some DNA or some RNA, depending on the virus. Okay. And what happens with this is the virus lands on one of your cells. So it just lands there. And it has this tube that it drills down through your cell membrane, right? And here's the DNA of the virus up in there. and then that DNA of the virus can go down through the tube and get into your cell. So now the virus DNA is inside your cell, right? And then here's your nucleus, and so that DNA will move into the nucleus, and it will insert itself in your DNA. So it inserts itself in there, and it starts commanding your DNA to make virus parts. Because DNA makes proteins, right? Transcription, translation, right? So it tells the DNA, make the legs, make the body, make the DNA of the virus, and then the virus assembles, and it keeps doing that, and doing that, and doing that, and doing that, until your cell becomes so big that it bursts. And then all those little viruses are out, ready to go off and attack one of your other cells. Okay? So that's kind of how the viruses work. Yes?
So is that why, like, when you have a virus, they don't give you antibiotics because it's just going to burst on its own and you can't force it?
Right, exactly. Well, and antibiotics, one of the main things they do is they destroy the cell wall of bacteria. And human cells don't have cell walls,
Yeah.
so antibiotics work with bacteria without, damaging our cells.
Okay.
Antibiotics will not work with the virus because they don't have cell walls. They're not even really they can't live unless they are infecting our cells. So we'd have to destroy our cells to destroy the virus. So, okay, so then,
The virus will attach to like any cell or a specific
Yep.
cell?
nope, it's just going to go out and find this, the cells in your body and infect them. Yeah, so. Okay, and depending on the virus, of course, is it going to be, respiratory, digestive? So it does have some, specific areas that it likes depending on the virus. Now, so now we know how the pathogens kind of attack our cells. But going back to the T cell, yes,
Sorry.
that's okay.
The bacteria doesn't do the DNA thing?
No,
It just like binds to the cell and it
and
doesn't work
it's
properly
gonna
anymore.
right. It's gonna alter the function of the cell, but it's not necessary. It's not gonna take over the DNA and make the cell start producing more bacteria.
So it divides by itself.
It
like-
will divide by itself like a normal cell. Yep. And you'll find that in microbiology because you'll put bacteria on a little agar, and you'll watch it grow. So
So if you
Little
alter
petri
that,
dish.
doesn't that signal to the lymphocytes to kill it?
yeah. So that's getting a little further in depth. But when your cells become infected, one of the things they do is through the MHC protein, they present the, because your cells are also in there trying to destroy it with the lysosomes, trying to break it up, and it's taking the little antigen and presenting it outside the cell. That's how the T cells become activated then. The T cells are going to bind to the MHC protein and the antigen, and yeah. So what we want to know, okay, so going back to general A&P, the T cells, right? The T cells, they are either going to be activated by one of your cells that are infected like this, or they're going to become activated by a macrophage. Remember the macrophages? So the macrophage can just engulf a bacteria, right? And so once it engulfs the bacteria, now the bacteria is inside your cell, okay? And now it's inside a macrophage. And then the T cell is going to become activated by that cell, by that infected cell, all right? So that's why that's why we call this the cell-mediated immunity, because your cells have to be infected in order for that T cell to become activated, right? Now, when the T cell is activated, it's going to be able to divide into 4 different types of cells. I'm going to see quickly if they have another picture of the 4 different types of cells. Yeah, all right, so I'm going to just go here. So the T cells, they're going to go through division, and they can specialize to become a cytotoxic T cell. Now the cytotoxic T cell is just like the natural killer cell. It's going to shoot out those bullets, those chemical bullets, those perforins, and it's going to do that at any of the infected cells that are infected with the same pathogen that activated it. So if this was activated again by, say it was activated by Staph aureus, and this cell is infected with Staph aureus, then that cytotoxic T cell will shoot bullets at it, poke holes in it, and make it burst. Okay? So that's one of the cells. One of the T cells is a cytotoxic T cell. Another type of T cell is going to be a memory T cell. The memory T cell, again, is not going to do anything disinfection. So it's going to wait until the body wins and we're all back to normal, and then the next time you become infected with that same pathogen, it's going to attack that. Well, not attack it, but it's going to start multiplying and becoming one of the 4 different T cells. Okay, so it becomes activated, basically. Another type of T cell is called a helper T cell. Okay, now the helper T cell, it's a helper. So it's going to run off and activate other T cells. Or it's going to run off and activate the B cell. It's a helper cell. That's what it is, a helper T cell. And the last type of T cell that we have is called a suppressor T cell. I think they now call it the regulatory T cell. So what the regulatory T cell does is that after you are winning this war, after your cells have all of those pathogens under control and it looks like you're going to win and not die, then that regulatory T cell is going to start to slow down the T cells, the activated T cells and B cells, because we don't want those cells going crazy and attacking your own cells just because they're overactive. So they just help to slow everything down after you're winning. Okay, so those are the different types of lymphocytes. Now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, there's 2 different stages of immunity, and we call these your first line of defense, your second line of defense, and your third line of defense. So your one type of immunity is called innate immunity. Innate immunity. And this is an immunity. Innate means you're born with it. Okay, so you're born with the innate immunity. That means that everybody should have this stuff, right? Genetically, some people are going to have better than others, but everybody's going to be born with it. And it also is non-specific. It's non-specific. So again, it really doesn't matter if it's strep pneumoniae or Staph aureus or chicken pox or what it is, it's going to protect you against anything.
This is what the mom passes for the placenta or no?
We'll talk about that in a minute. That's coming up. Okay, all right, so innate immunity, you're born with this. This is you, not passing it to anybody. This is just your body and all the things your body has to protect yourself. And so under this, we have the first line of defense. And your first line of defense is just trying to keep the pathogen from entering your body. We want to stop it from entering your body. So that first line of defense is basically going to be physical barriers. Physical barriers. So we're going to talk about those in just a second, all right? They're innate. You're born with those physical barriers. They're non-specific. The second line of defense, okay, this is going to happen after the bacteria or the pathogen gets inside your body, and now you need cellular responses, but they're still non-specific, and you're born with these defenses. So we call those cellular defenses. And there's a number of those that we're going to talk about, okay? And then we're going to talk about the second type of immunity, which is called adaptive immunity. And adaptive immunity, you're not born with it, so you have to acquire it. You have to acquire it. It's very specific, and it deals with those lymphocytes, the B and T lymphocytes. So the T cells and B cells. T cells, B cells. All right, hopefully you guys can see that in the back. All right, so we've got innate immunity, adaptive immunity. Adaptive immunity is also, this is our third line of defense. All right. First and second are innate. Third line is adaptive. So let's just go over. We'll start with our first line of defense, which is a physical barrier. Part of the innate immunity. So everybody's born with this defense. Physical barriers are going to, what's going to keep the bacteria out? What's a physical barrier that keeps it out? Skin, right? Skin on the outside. Mucous membranes on the inside of your mouth and your nasal cavity, right? Okay, so you've got mucous membranes. That's in all of the passageways in your body that are leading outside. So you've got the vaginal canal, and you've got the rectum, and you have the mouth and the nasal cavity. These are all covered by the mucous membranes. So those are physical. What else do we have that's physical? Hair. Hair is going to keep the pathogen from even touching your skin, right? We want to prevent these things from getting in. Then we also, the physical barriers also include secretions. Your sweat secretes a fluid that's very salty, right? It's a salty fluid. Why do we use salt in preservatives? Why do we use salt to preserve meat? Because salt kills bacteria, right? Salt kills pathogens. So this salty secretion on your skin is going to kill off those bacteria and not let them in, right? And then we have the sebaceous glands. Remember the sebaceous glands? What type of substance do they secrete? Sebum, which is real oily, right? So the oil can cover the area too. It's hard for those pathogens to get inside when it has to try to get in through those secretions. So the physical barriers include the skin, the hair, and the secretions, right? And now once that pathogen has gotten inside your body, now we have to go to the second line of defense. Now we need cells to step up. And these are going to be non-specific because the specific ones take a little bit longer. So we need our first team of cells coming out there to help us against these. So there's a number of those, and we're going to go through those. So the first cells are, we have phagocytes. We know what phagocytes are. They engulf things, and they digest them with lysosomal enzymes. Remember these? The neutrophil, that's a white blood cell that's phagocytic. The eosinophil, that one too is for parasitic worms, right? That's phagocytic. The monocyte is phagocytic, and then when the monocyte squeezes out of the blood and goes to other tissues, it's called a macrophage. Those are all phagocytic cells that can engulf anything that looks abnormal. Okay? Whether it's one of your cells that's infected, whether it's a bacteria, whatever it is, it's going to engulf it. Then we have that immune surveillance. So which cell was part of the immune surveillance? The NK cell, right? The natural killer cell. So the natural killer cell is one of your second line of defense. It's part of your innate immunity. And it's going to shoot chemicals out at anything that looks abnormal and make them burst. Then we have these things that are called interferons. And interferons are little chemicals that your specific cells in your body will produce if they get infected. Okay, so if the macrophages get infected, if the lymphocytes get infected, these cells will produce these interferons. And the interferons, their job is to slow down viral replication. They slow down viral replication. So that picture I drew where the virus goes in and takes over your DNA and makes the body parts of the virus and then assembles the viruses, it slows that whole process down. Because if we can slow that down, that gives your immune system enough time to maybe destroy that cell before that cell bursts with all of those viral parts, right? So, okay, so it slows down viral replication. So those are interferons. The next cellular defense that we have, still in the second line of defense, we have the complement system. So the complement system complements the antibodies, right? So if you remember antibodies, and on the red blood cell, the antibodies would, here's an antibody, here's an antibody, here's an antibody. So what they did on the red blood cells was they would bind to the red blood cells like that, and they would make them burst, right? They bound to the antigens on the red blood cell. They'll do the same thing with the bacteria. So there's a bacteria, so the antibodies will bind to the bacteria, do the same exact thing. They either act like flags, and they flag down the macrophages to come over and engulf this mess, or they cause those cells to burst, right? So these complements, these are proteins that complement the antibodies. So they act a lot like the antibodies. So what the complement proteins do, and it's kind of a cascading event where this group of proteins will activate this group, which will activate this group, and then these complement proteins are going to bind themselves to that pathogen or to that infected cell until it bursts, right? So that's how it complements the antibodies. It acts a lot like antibodies in that way. Here we see a bacteria, here we see the complement proteins attaching to it, here we see that bacteria bursting. Okay? The next one we have is called inflammation. We talked about inflammation when we talked about the basophils. Basophils are the white blood cells, right? Basophils are white blood cells. Mast cells are just like the basophils. Okay, if you remember, there's little granules inside there. The mast cells are going to be found in, they're going to be in the tissues, not in the blood. And whenever there's an injury, that's where they're going to be found. And so these little granules here, they're going to secrete histamine and heparin. Histamine and heparin, just like the basophils do. And then they're going to cause the 4 cardinal signs of inflammation. Do you guys remember what those are? Heat, swelling, redness, pain, right? And then the 5th one is loss of function. Okay, so we've got the mast cell creating all of that by the increased blood flow and the increased permeability of those blood vessels. And then the last cellular defense that we have under innate immunity, the last one that we have is called fever. Okay, so there are these cells in your body that can make your temperature go up. All right, well, your normal body temperature is what? 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37.2 degrees Celsius, right? So that happens to be the ideal temperature for many pathogenic bacteria to grow. There's many bacteria that love that temperature. And so when you have a normal body temperature, they can just multiply and multiply and multiply and just go crazy and infect your body. As a matter of fact, guess what the incubator temperature of our microbiology lab is? It's 37.2, right? It's 37.2 degrees Celsius because that's how the bacteria are going to grow the best. That's the temperature. All right, so what your body does is the pyrogens, these cells, are going to increase the temperature of your body so that it goes above that. Because if we can get that above, that temperature, 37.2 degrees Celsius, then that slows down the bacteria from replicating. They're not going to be able to reproduce as fast. That gives our cells more time to attack these cells, these pathogens. Okay, how are you guys doing? You need a break, maybe? I've been talking for an hour. I don't have a whole lot left, so I can keep going if you want. Okay, we'll finish up here. All right. This picture is showing the different types of T cells and B cells. You know, so like I told you, this would be a great diagram to study. All you have to know is a little bit about each one. T cells can be cytotoxic. That's going to directly shoot chemicals out. Helper T cells, those are going to get other T cells and B cells to help. Regulatory T cells, they're going to help to slow down after we start to win. Memory T cells, they're going to hang out until we get the next infection. We have the B cells. B cells will differentiate into plasma cells. They produce antibodies. Antibodies will attack the pathogen, or they can become memory B cells, and again, they're going to wait. And then we have those natural killer cells that were part of the innate immunity. So the T cells and the B cells, those are the ones that are going to be part of the third line of defense. So when your second line of defense starts to get overwhelmed and they're just not able to control or win, then the T cells and B cells, by this time, they've had enough time to become activated, to differentiate into those other cells. B cells will produce antibodies. T cells will produce the cytotoxic T cells, and hopefully we'll be able to win that way, right? So that is that's those cells, and that's part of the adaptive immunity. Now, with adaptive immunity, number one, it's very specific. Those T cells and B cells are only going to respond to one type of pathogen. Okay? So you have to acquire this. So when a baby is first born, the baby doesn't have an adaptive immune system. The first time it really comes in contact with any pathogen should be as it's coming through the vaginal canal, right? And then from then on, it's going to be pummeled by all sorts of different pathogens as the baby's growing, right, outside of the womb. Okay, so then it has to develop a T cell that's going to fight off that bacteria, and a T cell that's going to fight off that bacteria, and a T cell that will respond to that one, and a B cell that will respond to that one. So it has to develop specific cells. No worries though, because you have enough B cells and T cells in your body to respond to anything that you come in contact with. You will acquire an immunity against that specific pathogen, all right? But that's why we say that it is specific and that it is required. The other thing is it has a memory because of those memory cells. They will remember that pathogen the next time it comes in, and then they can immediately start dividing into these cells. Okay? So that's our adaptive immunity. Now, with adaptive immunity then, you know, like I had told you before, it's important for you to understand that cell-mediated, that means it's the T cells, and the T cells become activated only when your cells are infected. That's why it's cell-mediated. Antibody-mediated, that means it's your B cells. That's the immune system that your B cells give you, the immunity that your B cells give you, and that's when the B cells become activated by either a pathogen directly or by a helper T cell, and they will secrete antibodies. Okay, now the next thing we're going to talk about is different forms of immunity. Okay, different forms of immunity. And so I'm going to do another picture here because I think it's a little bit easier than that. All right, so with immunity, there are four different ways to develop immunity. So there's ways to develop immunity. They can be developed naturally, so we could say naturally acquired. Your immunity can be naturally acquired. Your immunity can, can be induced. Okay. Your immunity can be active, and your immunity can be passive. That's how you can receive it. So this is how do we acquire, how do we get this immunity? So first of all, naturally acquired, this is when you get immunity through the environment. So, okay, so you're getting it through the environment. Induced is when you're getting the immunity through a health professional, like an injection or drops, right? So we've got naturally acquired, and then we have induced. Then we have active and passive. Active immunity means that you receive the antigen. So you're receiving the antigen. Now, the antigen can either be the whole bacteria. You know, the whole bacteria has antigens on it. Goodness. Okay, so the bacteria has antigens on it. So maybe you're coming in contact with the whole antigen, or maybe you're coming in contact with just the toxins that the antigen are putting out, right? Or chopped up pieces of bacteria. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but you're receiving the antigen. When your body receives the antigen, it has to act. It has to do something. It has to produce antibodies. It has to produce the cytotoxic T cell. It has to act. That's why it's very active, right? Passive, this means that you are receiving antibodies. You receive antibodies. So this is very passive. This means that your body doesn't have to do a thing. It is receiving antibodies. That's very passive, right? It doesn't have to make its own antibodies. It's receiving antibodies. All right, so now to put these together, let's put these together and think about, we can have naturally acquired active immunity. Naturally acquired active immunity. So when do you come in contact with an antigen through the environment? How? Okay, someone sneezes on you, someone coughs on you, someone sneezes on their hands and then shakes your hand. Someone sneezes in their hands and then touches the doorknob, and then you touch the doorknob, and then you touch your mouth, right? You're receiving that actual virus or bacteria through the environment, right? And it's the virus, if you're getting the antigens from that virus or bacteria. Okay, so now your body has to mount an active immune response, and then that came through the environment. So that would be an example of naturally acquired active. You get two kids playing together. One kid has chicken pox and the other kid doesn't. All of a sudden the other kid gets the chicken pox. Why? Because he developed naturally acquired active immunity, right? So he's trying to fight that chicken pox virus off that way, all right? Let's look at another one. Naturally acquired passive immunity. So when would a person receive antibodies through the environment? By what? By how? By breastfeeding, right? Breastfeeding, antibodies can cross over into the placenta too, but by nursing, right? That's one of the reasons why we say breastfeeding is so important. Those antibodies, they can cross into the breast milk, and then baby can get that breast milk. So naturally acquired passive, you're giving antibodies, it's coming through the environment, from mom to baby, right? All right, now let's look at the other ways. Let's look at induced active. Induced active. This is a health professional giving an antigen to somebody else. What is that? That's called a vaccination, right? So you know what vaccinations are? Vaccinations usually are not whole pathogens, unless they're drops, like the polio virus that you drop in the mouth, that's a whole pathogen. What vaccinations usually are is they take the pathogen and they chop it all up, and so it's not as virulent. It's not going to cause disease, but the antigens are there, and it'll cause your body to respond to it. So a health professional gives a vaccine, so they're giving the antigen, your body starts to produce memory cells. Starts to produce, usually not enough so that you actually get the disease, but you produce those memory cells, so if you ever come in contact with that chickenpox, kid, you're not going to get the chickenpox because you already have memory cells, right? Then the last one that we have is induced passive. When is a health professional going to give antibodies? Good. What? More like, so the reason why a health professional would want to give antibodies is because they're afraid you don't have enough time to actively develop your own antibodies. So it's going to be an emergency situation, like a snake bite, right? In a snake bite, you better give them immunoglobulins. You better give them antibodies so that that venom doesn't kill you, right? Doesn't kill the person. Another example?
What about like when you get the flu and they said you can go in and get like that Tamiflu or whatever they can give you? Is that sort of that kind of a thing?
Nope, that's a little different. That's just, it's not an antibiotic, but it's something that'll help to slow down viral replication.
Would it be like a bee sting, like with an EpiPen?
So that's interesting. That's not the same thing. Epi is just it's going to stimulate your sympathetic nervous system. So it's going to open your airway so that you're not getting anaphylactic shock.
That was my same question.
Okay, rabies, right? Rabies. You get bit by a rabid dog, you don't have time for your immune system to try to develop its own antibodies, so you give antibodies.
Tetanus?
So that's a good one. So tetanus, normally tetanus would be induced active because, that's a vaccination. So people will get the tetanus vaccination so that their body starts to develop antibodies against that specific pathogen. But if a person has not been vaccinated and they cut themselves with a rusty can or something, then you're not going to want to risk it because that's a really aggressive pathogen. That person will be given immunoglobulins as well. They'll be given antibodies. Antibodies are just not as safe as vaccinating. So, but yes.
You can receive antigens from bacteria and viruses.
Yes. Every cell in your body, in any cell, has antigens. And so with the viruses, they don't have a cell membrane and they don't have a cell wall. So their body parts are their antigens. That's, bacteria, they've got little antigens on the outside. And
So that vaccine that we get when you're a baby that gets it.
the smallpox, are you talking about?
The one that gets really
Big?
Yeah.
That's smallpox, and we don't give that anymore. Did you get it? I got it too, but they don't give that anymore because it's not very prevalent. They keep saying they might bring it back.
Would malaria be something like an induced passive? They can give you this
Yes. So induced active, any vaccination, which malaria is that's pills though, right? That's not really. So that's kind of like a vaccination. They can, yep.
My brother went to Africa and he had to take a bunch of
Yellow fever, malaria, that's
Get
a
all
whole
that
bunch of
malaria.
vaccinations.
He even
Yeah.
had to continue taking malaria pills after he got back for, I believe, about 2 weeks.
Okay,
So
Yeah.
I think it's more like an antibiotic.
yeah.
Can we say that unless you are receiving it, the antibodies, it depends only on your body. You can give medication to help, but it's your body that needs. Can we say that or no?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, now with these cancers, they're with like lung cancer. I just read an article where they're finding that immunotherapy is super helpful. Immunotherapy is where you're trying to build up your immune system. You're trying to build it up so your immune system is fighting those cells instead of medication that's doing the fighting for you. So it is you know, anytime you are making your body work and develop those antibodies, develop those memory cells, develop those cytotoxic T cells, that's good because you're making your army stronger.
And usually we get like tired when we're,
Yes.
when we are infected because the body wants to concentrate, is that
Yep,
right?
that's absolutely why. So when you, yes, you're gonna be tired and fatigued because all your ATP is gonna be going into the immune system, and it's not gonna be going into your muscles and your brain and, you know, these other areas. We have a war on our hand, so all cells, all cells on board, online. Any other questions on that? So we don't have enough time to do our endocrine game, but we will on Friday. All right, your lab exam is on Friday. Be prepared to right away